necessity drives me on. This is a key line of the Odyssey. I would mention it again at line 300. Necessity drives me on. This is Odysseus. I have to do this. I have to do this or I'm never going to get home. We're told, leaving the ship, he heads inland, and there all of a sudden Hermes, god of the golden wand, is like a young man, sporting his first beard, just in the prime and warm pride of youth. We're reminded, obviously, of Telemachus and Pisistratus from earlier in the play, no question. And he says, where are you going now, my unlucky friend? Trekking over the hills alone in unfamiliar country? And your men are all in there, in Circe's palace, cooped like swine. So it's Hermes that tells him, okay, but notice, it doesn't say they are swine, they're like swine, right? Have you come to set them free? In other words, you got to save your men one more time. Well, I warn you, you won't get home yourself. You'll stay right there, trapped with all the rest. By the way, let's point out the irony of this line. It's exactly what Odysseus does with his men once they're changed back into men for an entire year. Odysseus will be trapped on the island of Circe. Of course, he's also in Circe's bed, and by all accounts, she's a drop-dead gorgeous model goddess. Okay, so I mean, yeah, how much pain is it? Well, we'll get there. But wait, he says, Hermes, I can save you. Look, here's a potent drug. Take it to Circe's hall. Its power alone will shield you from the fatal day. Let me tell you all the witches, that's the first time she's been called an actual witch, subtle craft. She's going to mix you a bowl, just like we saw, the magic herb she's going to mix in. And the moment that Circe strikes you with her long, thin wand, you draw your sharp sword, see that your hip rushes her as fast, rushes her at her as though you're going to run her through. She'll cower in fear, coax you to her bed, but don't refuse the goddess's bed. Not then. Not if she's to release your friends and treat you well yourself. But have her swear the binding oath of the blessed God she'll never plot some new intrigue to harm you once you lie there naked. Never unman you, strip away your courage. And then with that we're told that he hands over the magic drug. And in fact he calls it Molly and he kind of explains it. And we're told that the gods only can mess with this dope. Then Odysseus, it works. Everything that's predicted works, right? He shows up with Circe, in he goes. She says at line 355, now she cried, off to your sty, you swine, and wallow with your friends. But Odysseus says, I drew my sharp sword sheathed at my hip and rushed as fast as if to run her through. She screamed, slid under my blade, hugged my knees. This is the exact same lines, by the way, that we will see when Achilles in the Iliad is trying to kill someone and they beg for help, right? And hugging the knees and all of that. With a flood of warm tears, burst of winging words, and we'll get this question. Who are you? Right? This is always the question. Who are you? Where are you from? Your city, your parents? I'm wonderstruck. You drank my drugs? You're not bewitched. Never has any other man withstood my portion. Never. Right? Once it's past his lips, he's drunk it down. You have a mind in you. No magic can enchant. You must be Odysseus, man of twists and turns. So you can see how, here we are in book 10, right? Almost halfway through the Odyssey, the poem, that we keep coming back to the opening lines, man of twists and turns. I know you, are you Odysseus? And of course she will say it. Hermes the giant killer, he always said you'd come. Homeward bound from Troy in your swift-like ship. Come, sheathe your sword. Let's go to bed together. Mount my bed. Mix in the magic work of love. We'll breed deep trust between us. So she enticed. But I fought back, still wary. Well, remember that Odysseus is always the skeptic, just like when Calypso told him, I'm going to help you to leave, right? He makes her promise on oath that he will take care of her. She swears, right? And then he says it. At last, I mounted Circe's gorgeous bed. Let's just point out that the first question he'll ask Penelope is, did you mess around on me? Because if you did, I'd kill you. The sexual double standard is in play. But notice, the way Odysseus tells the story, he didn't want to go to bed with Circe and then later Calypso. He was kind of forced to, like a consort of a kind, right? Well, we're going to have some nymphs who are going to help take care of Odysseus and provide him with Xenia. He'll be bathed. Lots of bathing, by the way, in the Odyssey, as you pointed out, right? And then, after he has sex, he's not interested in food at line 410. He had no taste for it. She asks him, what's the problem? Do you still suspect me of some treachery at line 420? And he says it to her, well, he says, how can I eat with my men still as pigs? So notice, he doesn't really think about his men until after he's had sex with Circe. And then he's like, if you really want me to eat and drink, set them free, all my beloved comrades. Let me feast my eyes. I love how the poet Homer plays games with words, like the word feast. It can mean eating, it can also mean seeing, right? So she changes the men back. They look younger, by the way, than they looked before. And then there's this terrible sobbing that takes place. We have a lot of crying, obviously, in the Iliad, or the Odyssey as well, right? And then she says it, go back to your ship at the water's edge, bring the rest of your crew with you. And that's exactly what Odysseus does. At line 450, I found my loyal crew consumed with grief and weeping live-warm tears, but now, and then there's this interesting simile. As calves in stalls when cows come home, droves of them herded back from field to farmyard, once they graze their fill, as all their young calves come frisking out to meet them, bucking out of their pens, lowing nonstop, jostling, rushing round their mothers, so my shipmates there at the sight of my return came pressing round me now, streaming tears, so deeply moved in their hearts they felt as if they'd made it back to their own land, their city, Ithaca's rocky soil. In other words, they were so happy to see me, it was like they had made it back home. Let's pay attention to the irony of this. We're going to be told that it will be a long time before he ever gets back. Why? Because he's going to spend a year on Circe's island, right? How thrilled we are. It's as if we'd reached our country, Ithaca, at last. He says it, let's return to Circe. Eurylochus says, absolutely no way. Odysseus says, I almost killed him. I was so mad at him, right? Because Eurylochus will, in fact, say it. She'll turn us into pigs or wolves or lions. Make no guard that palace, made to guard that palace of hers. By force, I tell you. And then he says it. Eurylochus says, just as the Cyclops at line 480 trapped our comrades in his lair with hot-headed Odysseus right beside them all, thanks to this man's rashness, they died too. In other words, it's Odysseus' fault all the men are died. Odysseus says, I was so mad I was ready to slice his head off, but each man tried to calm me down and said, come on, just lead us on the way. Eurylochus ultimately will join them. Circe will provide for the men. Circe will say to Odysseus, enough with the crying. Now, come at line 505. Eat your food, drink your wine, till the same courage fills your chest now as then when you first set sail from native land from rocky Ithaca. Now you are burnt out husks, your spirits haggard, seer, always brooding over your wanderings long and hard, your hearts never lifting with any joy. You suffered far too much. So she enticed and won our battle-hardened spirits over. And there we sat at ease, day in, day out, till a year had run its course, feasting on sides of meat and draughts of hitty wine. And then, when the year was gone and the seasons wheeled by and the months waned and the long days came round again, my loyal comrades took me aside and prodded, Captain, this is madness. High time you thought of your own home at last, if it really is your fate to make it back alive and reach your well-built house and native lands. Their urging brought my stubborn spirit round. In other words, Odysseus doesn't want to go home. Like the Lotus Eaters, he's enjoyed for a year being here. I mean, finally, he says it. I went to the luxurious bed of Circe, hugged her by the knees. So now, notice we have the inversion. Whereas before she was hugging his knees, now he's hugging hers. And the goddess heard my winging supplication. Circe, now make a good promise you gave me once. It's time to help me home. My heart longs to be home, line 533. My comrade's heart as well. They wear me down, pleading with me whenever you're away. In other words, my men really want to get home. It's fascinating that Odysseus will admit, I was having a pretty good time. In other words, one of the challenges of the Odyssey is we have a tendency to forget. The only sin is to forget. So I pressed, he says. And the lustrous god answered me in turn. Royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, old campaigner, stay no more in my house against your will. But first, another journey calls. This is, of course, the heart of the Odyssey, right? It's always one more journey, right? Another journey calls. You must travel down to the house of death, and the awesome one, Persephone. Notice it's not Hades. The continuation of the emphasizing of female or the woman in this poem. It's Persephone that you got to go down to in the underworld, right? There, to consult the ghost of Tiresias, son of seer of Thebes, the great blind prophet, whose mind remains unshaken. Even in death, Persephone has given him wisdom, everlasting vision to him, and him alone. The rest of the dead are empty, fleeting shades. Now, there's a whole lot that will be said in our next lecture, when we get to Book 11, about what this house of death or the underworld is all about, okay? But down there, we're told, you need to go and visit Tiresias. He's going to give you important instructions. Now we're going to ask this question in book 11. What instructions does Tiresias give to Odysseus that Circe couldn't give to Odysseus? Like, why does he got to go to the underworld, you know? Of course, this is the poet's way to give us another major adventure. So she said, and where Odysseus said, it says, crushed the heart inside me. I knelt in her bed and wept. I had no desire to go on living to see the rising light of day. But once I'd had my fill of tears and writhing there, at last I found the words to venture. Circe, Circe, who can pilot us on that journey? Who has ever reached the house of death in a black ship? Circe will give her instructions. She will say there's important rivers down there. Milton's Paradise Lost, by the way, will reference these rivers at line 565. In Milton's Paradise Lost, book 2, line 575 to 581. I comment on this, by the way, in my lectures on Milton's Paradise Lost. You can find those in the Harvard Classics lecture. When she says, when you finally get down there, you got to dig this trench. You got to pour down blood. Blood is necessary. You got to keep the ghosts away. It's even going to be his mother who shows up until Tiresias shows up, and the dead will come, and Tiresias will give you the information, right? She then puts on this lovely robe, slipped on this loose, glistening robe, which will immediately make us think about Helen in the Iliad at line 588. And then we're going to have, it's an interesting line. The queen slipped on a loose, glistening ground, filmy, a joy to the eye, and round her waist she ran a brocaded golden belt, and over her head a scarf to shield her brow. This is one of the reasons why some have argued that whoever this poet is, he couldn't have been male, it had to be female, because of the eye. For example, the way the woman dresses and the women's clothing. I don't know. I'll leave that one up to you. I brought the men round, he says, but he says, even before I left, I couldn't get all of them away healthy. And now we have the story of Elpenor at line 610. He goes up onto the house, and he sleeps up on the roof, and in the morning when he wakes up suddenly, we're back again to Odysseus waking up suddenly in book 6, line 130, he falls off the house, and his neck snapped from the backbone, right? He forgot to climb back down again by the long ladder, this notion of forgetting. And there we are. By the way, there's a story in the book of Acts, in the New Testament, that tells a similar thing where somebody falls out of a window, they've been sleeping. This idea of sleeping is an important motif, though, in the Odyssey. Notice Odysseus, almost home, then he decides to go to sleep, and that's when his guys open up the bag of winds and all of that, right? Finally, he says it to his warriors. You think we're headed home, our own dear land? Line 620. Well, Circe sets a different course for us. Down to the house of death and the awesome one Persephone, there to consult the ghost of Tiresias, seer of Thebes. So I said, and broke my shipmates' hearts just like she broke his. They sank down on the ground, moaning, tore their hair, but it gained us nothing. What good can come of grief? We've heard this mantra before, right? So we're back to the ship's edge. Circe's got to the dark hole before us. He says, there's a ram and a black ewe close by, and then slipped by. Who can glimpse a god who wants to be invisible, gliding here and there? It's an interesting question that the book will end with. Odysseus, notice, waits until they're just about to sail before he tells them, psych, we're not actually going home yet, right? This question, by the way, of what good can come of grief sounds very much like Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations when we study his. There's no point in crying, let's get to work, in other words. All right, so let's jump now to level 2A and some messages, right? It is easy to forget. Notice, a year with Circe, and all of a sudden Odysseus' men are like, dude, don't you think it's time we go home? Oh yeah, right? Another one, major message is here, trust is hard, right? Distrust will get you jacked, right? Aeolus' bag of winds, of course, lead Odysseus' men to open up that bag. They are certain that there is something. Now, it obviously begs the question, why Odysseus wouldn't just tell the men there's wind inside the bag? Maybe he didn't think they would believe him anyway. Maybe he didn't think it was their business. It's obviously a mistake. Another message, there always seems to be one more challenge in this poem. Did you notice this? It reminds us of, again, Whitman's Song of the Open Road, that last line, understand me well, that no matter what kind of success, fruition of success, a greater struggle is necessary. This is typical of the Odyssey. We're going to see it all the way through. At level 2B, well, think about the symbolism of Aeolus' bag. It obviously represents temptation, right? The Laestrygonians, well, they can kind of symbolize something that looks civilized, but in fact are not, very much very much uncivilized. And finally, Circe kind of symbolizes those dangerous weaving women, right? Okay, that we see constantly. I mean, notice the men are very attracted to her, and yet they're dangerous, right? The irony, of course, is that Odysseus does forget about home for a month with Aeolus, and then for a year with Circe in this book, right? The other irony, of course, is that men are turned into pigs, which many have sometimes said, well, this seems to be, when we study Plato's Republic, he will say this, that men have a tendency to just love to eat and sleep and make love, kind of like animals or pigs, right? We've certainly seen this idea in the Odyssey already, that there's a lot of feasting, and obviously there's a whole lot of drinking, and obviously there's some sex as well, right? Okay, 3a. What are we going to say in relationship to the Iliad? Well, let's just point out the role of Hermes. Obviously, in book 24, we have the young man who's coming to help Priam. Here, of course, it's the young man helping Odysseus with the dope, right? What is your favorite text about a witch who is beautiful but also dangerous? I mean, if you'll think about this, you see this a lot in the video games that you play, right? Beware of the beautiful woman and all of those kinds of things. And in some movies, right, they'll do that thing where she's really beautiful, but then she'll like change. I think, for example, of that key passage in The Shining, that film that maybe some of you are familiar with, where the woman is beautiful, but then she turns and she's horrified. At level 3b, well, you knew this one was coming. What's a time you forgot your mission and then kind of woke up and went, oh yeah, right? What was a time that you had to deal with jealous friends, right, who screwed it up and you had to forgive them and keep going? Notice Odysseus, do I jump out of the boat or do I just, stick with it? What was a time you went from luxury, right, they've been on for a year in luxury, to hell? I once had a student that said, wow, this is like, for example, the 100 days of summer, and then all of a sudden at the end of the summer I've got to go to football 3-a-days, and I've been kind of lying around playing video games, drinking Mountain Dew, and then all of a sudden I'm supposed to show up, and oh man, it's rough, it's hell. Well, speaking of hell, let's go to hell, right? So we're going now, not hell, Hades, the house of the dead as it will be translated, okay, book 11. Some have argued the most important book of all of the Odyssey in implication. Certainly the book that St. Augustine read and knew well when he came to his Christian theology about what happens when hell is mentioned in the New Testament, and what's up with that. Of course, Virgil will make it very popular. He'll have a journey to hell as well. And of course, that'll lead us to Dante and his trip into Inferno. And then finally, of course, Milton in Paradise Lost. So what we're about to work with now in Book 11 will have implications, huge implications, for our study of other texts to come. Of course, Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit will come to mind as well. Come back. I hope you're enjoying the study as much as am I. Thank you.